Hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Administer Your American Rescue Plan, ARP Act Stabilization Funds. We're excited to have you all join us for this session today during the ACF Indigenous Programs Conference. Before we begin, we will be sharing some instructions on how you can interact during this session. So Young, you may be on mute.
Yep, it was stuck for a second there. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Young Brinson, and I will be the ACF room monitor for this workshop. And I'm going to share some quick housekeeping items before I turn it over to our presenters today. So if you have questions during this presentation, please submit them in the chat box, and I will monitor and record these for the Q&A session. If you have questions during the Q&A session, please raise your Zoom hand located at the bottom of your screen or submit your questions in the chat box. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. Please note that I have provided a survey link in the chat box as well, which you'll see right now. And we would appreciate capturing your feedback and thoughts on this session, which you can do by taking the survey after this workshop. And I will provide that link again at the end of the session for a reminder. And the survey link can also be found on the live agenda on the ACF IPC website, along with the session's presentation handout for download. Finally, as a quick reminder, all workshop sessions are being recorded for an on-demand viewing via the 2022 ACF Indigenous Programs Conference website until April 25th, 2022. Please visit the live agenda page if you would like to view these recordings after the conference. So I will now turn it over to our ACF workshop facilitator, or presenter rather, Lisa Blackman, to get us started.
Lisa, you may be on mute.
Okay. Shar, can you hear me now? Shar, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. Hi, and good afternoon or good evening, everyone, from wherever you may be joining us today. Welcome to our American Rescue Plan Act Child Care Stabilization Grants webinar. We ask today that you please share in the chat box your name, the tribal grantee that you're representing, and your role. So let's get started. I first wanted to introduce myself. My name is Lisa Blackman Fergus, and I'm with the Office of Child Care, Region 6, which is located in Dallas, Texas. I work with 21 tribes as well as the state of Oklahoma. And so for today's webinar, we wanted to just share some of the objectives for you. We wanted to look at increased understanding and awareness of the core components of the American Rescue Plan, ARP, Act Child Care Stabilization Grants. We want to explore steps to implementing your ARP Act Child Care Stabilization Grants, as well as innovative examples, as well as identifying some best practices for record keeping, reporting, and budget planning. And I wanted to pause one moment to just also share that I am battling with some seasonal allergies. And so I may at times have to ask for some tag team and support from Rachel as well as Tricia. So we will manage this, and that is also the reason that I am not showing our video as well. So, okay, and so the next slide is that OCC released the guidance on this funding stream in an information memorandum available online. The guidance in the IM applies to tribes with all allocation sizes, which are small, medium, and large allocations, as well as Public Law 102477 grantees. The ARP Act appropriated nearly $24 billion for child care stabilization funds. Funds were awarded to tribal lead agencies on April 15th of 2021. Tribes received a per child amount and a base amount of $30,000 for individual tribes. Consortium received $30,000 for each consortium member, or a prorated amount for members with fewer than 50 children. The IAM can be found on the following link, which is located on the presentation slides, as well as resources that will be provided during the presentation. And so some of you may be wondering how to navigate all of this and where to begin, as many of you may be at different points in implementing these funds. So let's just take a time to break down each stage of the implementation to better assist you in getting started. Next slide, please. In order to correctly obligate and liquidate your funds, it's important to read the guidance that's related to the funding award. The Office of Child Care released guidance on 3 CCDF funding streams under the ARP Act. But today we're only going to be discussing one of the funding streams, which is the ARP Act Child Care Stabilization Funds. The Child Care Stabilization Funds are a new time-limited program that supports the entire child care industry. It's also used to reach providers regardless of if they did receive past subsidy participation. It's used as funding for subgrants to child care providers. It's not intended for direct child care services or slots. And more importantly, its obligation and liquidation periods are near, and we also wanted to pay specific attention to those dates. The obligation period ends September 30th of 2022, and the liquidation period ends September 30th of 2023. And we'll go into more detail throughout this presentation. Next, we're going to be focusing on some of the ARP Act's Child Care Stabilization spending requirements. As you'll see, that the funds are exempt from CCDF spending requirements that are related to quality, direct services, and admin costs. At least 80% of the funds need to go to subgrants for qualified child care providers, which we will share some of those definitions as well. Tribal grantees may set aside up to 20% of the stabilization award for administration, activities to support supply building, and technical assistance. Please note that the base amount funds are not subject to the admin cap. And something that is unique and specific to tribes is that they may use the funds for construction or major renovation. And this is after following the application process and receiving approval from ACF for construction and renovation. But please note that the deadline for requesting those funds to use for construction or major renovation has passed. Next, we're going to talk about the set aside for the administration, supply building, and technical assistance. And please note that this set aside that we're referring to is not related to set aside related to construction. I just wanted to clarify that for you. And so tribal grantees may set aside up to 20% of the stabilization award for, as previously mentioned, administration, activities to support supply building, as well as technical assistance. But there are 5 specific activities which are mentioned in the OCC guidance. And so the funds can be used to administer the stabilization subgrants. It can be used to increase the supply of childcare and activities associated with it. It can be also used for technical assistance to support for subgrant applications, as well as for providers to meet requirements throughout that subgrant, and publicizing the availability of subgrants. Again, we just wanted to note that the base amounts are not subject to the admin cap. So with that being said, we have received many questions of what makes a provider eligible and qualified to receive a subgrant. So there are two paths to be considered as a qualified and eligible provider. The first path is that the provider meets CCDF requirements, including health and safety, and that the provider is licensed, regulated, or registered. The second path is that the provider was licensed, regulated, or registered as of March 11th of 2021, and that the provider meets the applicable tribal and health and safety standards at the time of application. So in determining who is an eligible provider, lead agencies can take into account any existing approved CCDBG waivers regarding the definition of a provider or the CCDF health and safety requirements. And so childcare providers are not required to meet requirements that have been temporarily waived due to the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic. However, we do want to remind lead agencies that these temporary waivers did expire on September 30th of 2021. After that time, lead agencies will need to support the CCDF providers in meeting health and safety as well as background checks. Okay, we're going to continue talking about qualified and eligible providers. The ARP Act and guidance provides requirements and recommendations about which providers may be eligible to receive subgrants. And so in order to be considered as a qualified provider, the provider must meet the following conditions on the date of the application submission. So the first is that you must be an eligible provider by meeting either that Path 1 or Path 2, which is defined in the ARP Act, be open to provide childcare services, or temporarily closed due to the public health, financial hardship, or other reasons related to COVID-19. Then tribal lead agencies should define acceptable reasons for closure and have broad reasons, as well as allowing the provider to provide self-verification. So ultimately, tribal lead agencies determine the providers they include. Also, the subgrants are designed to be awarded to providers regardless of whether they previously received federal funds. CCDF eligible providers may receive subsidy payments as well as subgrants at the same time. So as a point of clarification, this is not considered as double dipping or supplantation. And then that leads us into talking about tribally operated centers. So let's take a look at that. So there's been many questions that have been received by OCC regarding tribally operated centers and funding the TOCs with stabilization funds. So tribally operated centers are eligible to receive stabilization funds from the tribal lead agency. The ARP Act Child Care Stabilization Funds must be used to supplement and not supplant tribal funds that were used to operate the center. Tribally operated centers that are also licensed by a state agency may also be eligible to receive a subgrant from the state, but that is at the state's discretion and based on their application guidelines and criteria. Tribally operated centers may receive stabilization grants from the tribe and from the state at the same time. And we wanted to let you know that you can find additional clarification around using stabilization funds in a published frequently asked questions. And we'll drop the link in the chat. And as always, if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to your regional office for assistance. It's really important to note that there are some key dates that are associated with the ARP Act stabilization grants and funding. By April 1st, which is just a couple of weeks away, a tribal lead agency should notify ACF if funds cannot be obligated by September 30th of 2022. In the event that they cannot be obligated, that gives an opportunity for those funds to be reallocated to be used by other tribes. And please note, I wanted to emphasize that this is related to the obligation. So if you don't feel that your program would be able to obligate all of the funds by September 30th of this year, please notify ACF to ensure that it can be a part of the reallotment process. And more importantly, note the dates of the obligation and liquidation timeframes. Obligation, again, is September 30th of 2022. And all funds must be liquidated by September 30th of 2023. We did want to note that obligation and liquidation timeframes do not apply to tribes who operate under a PL 102477 consolidated plan. The obligation and liquidation dates apply specifically to those that are direct funded. Next slide. Let me get there. Now let's spend some time discussing the ARP Act stabilization subgrants. So subgrant applications for childcare providers must follow some specific guidelines. The applications need to be posted on a tribal childcare website or another associated website for the tribe. Please consider that the applications shouldn't be burdensome and only ask the necessary information that the lead agency needs to determine the eligibility as well as the award amount. It should be in plain language and available in multiple languages, if possible. Tribal lead agencies should also provide TA and other supports for providers completing the application. You can use different types of applications for different provider types. The applications can be updated anytime throughout the grant period, and they can also be accepted on a rolling basis and processed in a timely manner. And in order to certify the applications from childcare providers, they need to meet requirements throughout the subgrant period. They need to implement policies that are aligned with health and safety guidance, and continue to pay at least the same wages and benefits for staff, and to not decrease those wages or benefits, even as a result of receiving a subgrant, because as mentioned earlier, this is to support the childcare industry and sector. And if at all possible, continue to provide relief from co-payments and tuition for parents. As part of the certifications, you can have check boxes on the application and treat the actual submission of the application as the certification. And the tribal lead agency does have discretion on determining how it will be monitored, and the documentation needed to ensure that providers are meeting those requirements. Next, we're probably wondering, well, how do we even determine these amounts, or what should be considered? So the child care subgrant amounts must be based on the provider's current operating expenses, including costs that could be associated with providing or preparing to provide child care services during the pandemic. And it should cover sufficient operating expenses to ensure that you have continuous operation for the intended period of the subgrant. The lead agencies have great discretion, wide discretion, on how subgrant amounts are formulated. And the purpose to stabilize the child care sector during and after the COVID-19 public health emergencies, it should really be considered that you should limit the burden and the bureaucracy on child care providers and ensure that the subgrants are sufficient in size and duration to support continuous operation. Lead agencies have several options for determining cost to providers and the grant amounts. But you should also take into account the true cost of providing high quality child care, including the cost of attracting and retaining a qualified and skilled workforce. Some other items to consider is that the funds must be awarded in advance of provider expenditures and cannot be considered as reimbursements. The subgrant amount should cover sufficient operating expenses. It is encouraged to provide subgrants for at least 6 months and really limit collecting new information. The amount should reflect significant resources provided in the ARP Act and may also be higher than private pay rates and prices. So again, just wanting to emphasize that the purpose of the stabilization funding is to primarily support the child care industry and the supply of child care. Next, we're going to look at a process for awarding the subgrants. As we have mentioned throughout, is that tribes have discretion in how they will award the subgrants. And guidance has been included for some recommended models, which are looking at maybe prioritizing small child care programs, those that need recurring subgrants, also multiple subgrant programs to focus on different priorities or different services or maybe some unmet needs. Also providing bonuses or other supplemental funds for providers meeting certain needs of families. And you may adjust how subgrants are awarded throughout the funding period. You're encouraged to do so based on receiving feedback from the providers, your parents, and the communities that you're serving. Know that that was a lot of information to process, and we will have an opportunity at the end to answer any questions, as well as we encourage you to include your questions or comments in the chat box so we can follow up with you. So at this time, I'm now going to pass it off to Tricia to walk us through a tribal lead agency's innovative work.
Thank you, Lisa. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tricia Peoples, and I'm with the Tribal Child Care Capacity Building Center, and I'm the subject matter expert for emergency preparedness and disaster response and recovery. We would like to take some time to spotlight one tribal lead agency that is doing some amazing work to ensure that their subgrants were awarded. In this example of tribal innovative practices for implementing ARP Act Child Care Stabilization subgrants, this tribal aid agency used their funds to help stabilize the child care industry as the tribe continued to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The tribe provided financial relief to child care providers to help cover unexpected business costs associated with the COVID-19 pandemic and to help stabilize their operations so that they may continue to provide care. The Tribal Lead Agency Stabilization Subgrant Award Program Plan represents a collaborative, multi-step process designed to identify the needs of childcare providers and ensure timely administration and access to ARP Act stabilization funding. The funding provided subgrants to qualified eligible childcare providers to support the stability of the childcare sector for existing childcare businesses during and after the COVID-19 public health emergency. The Tribal Lead Agency used a 7-step process to develop its subgrant policies and procedures, as you can see on the screen. Within each of these key components listed, this Tribal Lead Agency has tried to break down the necessary steps from start to finish, including meetings, materials, and resources they found instrumental to administering their subgrants. In addition to these key stages they have identified, they have also created a list of helpful forms to help in the administration, implementation, and monitoring of their subgrant program. For example, they developed forms for a category list of allowable expenses for stabilization subgrants, and they used that during their pre-planning phases. They created a form for estimated monthly costs of operations, budget expense tracking tool with categories for the providers, and also a monthly cost of operations expense report within their award plan. We encourage other Tribal Lead agencies to connect with Tribal Lead agencies who are taking similar steps to assist with their own implementation. For more information on this Tribal Lead agency's work or to request assistance, be sure to reach out to your regional office or your regional TA specialist. And now we want to talk about the ARP Act Child Care Stabilization Grant implementation stages. In any implementing, there are stages of development. The stages we have identified are, the first one is exploring. And in an exploring stage, your program is aware of this requirement but hasn't taken any action yet. You're assessing your readiness to address the requirement, or you're thinking about how to approach it. In the developing stage, your program has started making arrangements and preparing for this requirement by acquiring the resources. For example, hiring additional staff, training, written plans, etc. The things that you need to move forward. In the initial implementation stage, your program has started to address the requirement. You are assessing your approach and identifying the implementing strategies for improvement. Staff is trying to make necessary changes and follow the new requirements. Your program might meet some of the components of the requirement, but not all. At full implementation, which is the last stage, your program meets all components in this requirement. All of the components are embedded in your program's policies and procedures and practices. Systems are in place for monitoring, training, and communicating regarding the standard. Staff is consistently implementing the requirement and adhering to established policies and procedures. This requirement is part of your ongoing program and staff operations, and it is updated regularly to ensure best practices. We will be taking a look at some innovative ways tribal grantees have been working to plan, spend, and implement their ARP Act funds in the next couple of slides. So keep these stages in mind as we move through this. So back to the exploring stage. In this example, this Tribal Lead Agency wants to issue subgrants specifically to provide bonuses to workers at childcare centers. So during the exploring stage, they have identified the need to pay the bonuses through discussions with childcare providers and exploring retention strategies. Using the same example, in the developing stage, this Tribal Lead Agency will create a formula to award subgrants to providers based on the number of workers, and then develop an application for providers to ensure that funds would be used to provide bonuses for the childcare workers. And the next stage, initial implementation. After reaching the initial implementation stage, they are nearly close to full implementation. So this Tribal Lead Agency has advertised the subgrant on their website with the application and process for applying. Applications have begun to be received, processed, and some have been awarded. And the final implementation stage for the Tribal Lead Agency that wants to issue subgrants specifically to provide bonuses to workers at childcare centers They have reviewed the bonuses awarded, developed a plan for tracking and reporting ARP childcare stabilization grants. Systems for monitoring, training, and communicating are all in place, and the staff is consistently implementing the requirements and adhering to established policies, procedures, and practices. I'd like to take a minute to spotlight one tribal lead agency's innovative work with their subgrant program. This tribal lead agency awarded subgrants to providers ranging in amounts from $3,000 to $10,000. They based the subgrant amounts on the size of the provider's program, the number of children that was served, and the needs specified in the stabilization grant applications. They have awarded $145,000 of the $188,000 they received in ARP childcare stabilization funds, and they will soon have awarded $165,000 in total to all of their childcare providers. Their overall plan is to use all stabilization funds for subgrants to providers. They did not need to spend the set aside as they use their existing website to notify providers about the availability of funds and how to apply, etc. To build capacity, the tribe has given subgrants to qualified eligible providers that previously did not provide childcare services for the tribe. By adding that additional contracted providers, the tribe increased parent choice and is building the childcare supply for their tribal service area. Providers are using funds to repair roofing, purchase a new washer and dryer, and purchase new kitchen equipment. The tribal lead agency conducts site visits and documents the visits with CCDF checklists to ensure health and safety requirements are being met by all providers receiving subgrants. Now that we reviewed the stages of implementation and some innovative examples, let's shift our focus to ARP stabilization reporting requirements and explore how accurate record keeping will ensure that integrity and accountability are maintained during processes. We've heard from some tribal lead agencies that they are struggling with provider reporting and monitoring. As you develop your processes, tribal lead agencies should expect the following regarding provider reporting and monitoring. You need to balance the need to collect information that's necessary to ensure your funds are spent correctly, but not overburden your providers with collecting this information. Lead agencies should collect the following information from providers receiving subgrants: the provider's address, including the zip code, race and ethnicity of center director or family child care owner, the gender of center director or family child care owner, if the provider was open or temporarily closed at the time of the application, how the funds were used, documentation to show how they met the required certifications. As important to note, these funds are subject to the same reporting requirements as CCDF funds, unless you are a PL 102477 tribe. Those tribes should refer to the Dear Colleague letter for further guidance, and we will drop this link into the chat box for you. The Tribal Child Care Capacity Building Center has a budgeting tool that is available to grantees to use to budget their CCDF expenses. By requesting TA through your regional office, a tribal TA specialist can provide you with a demonstration, assist you in adding additional pages to the workbook to track additional CCDF years, and additional pages to track the various COVID-19 relief funds. You can also access our Fiscal On Demand session link. We will drop that link in the chat box to see a recorded demonstration. We know CCDF administrators and their fiscal departments are worried about integrity and internal controls as stabilization grant funds are distributed. A new resource has been developed by the Office of Child Care, Strengthening Stabilization Grant Integrity with Internal Controls. This brief and child care stabilization grantee internal controls self-assessment were developed to guide tribal lead agencies in reviewing and evaluating their internal controls for the child care stabilization grant program. The brief provides strategy considerations for tribal lead agencies on how to leverage existing policies and create new program integrity policies and procedures. The self-assessment instrument allows agencies to self-evaluate, prioritize, and monitor risk in their area, in their policies and procedures to assure compliance with the ARP Act of 2021. The tribal lead agency fiscal risk assessment was developed for CCDF tribal lead agency administrators, fiscal and management officials, and other tribal lead agency leaders as a framework for reviewing how well policies and procedures meet the CCDF requirements in the area of program integrity and fiscal accountability. This worksheet can be used by tribal lead agencies as part of a fiscal management training or at any time to assess how well your internal controls are working and to determine what, where, and how improvements can be made. We will also drop the link to this handy resource in the chat box for you. On the screen, you will see the new resource created by the Tribal Child Care Capacity Building Center. This tool is an editable PDF for grantees to track their obligation and liquidations for the various funding streams. Grantees can enter their tribal entity name, award amounts, and OGM specialist contact information. The funding codes for each of the funding streams are included, as well as a drop-down list to select the grant year and quarter that applies. On the second page, there are 4 informative quick reference charts concerning the CARES, CRSA, ARP stabilization, and ARP discretionary funds. These charts list exemptions as well as applicable reporting requirements and is designated with either a red X or a green check mark. A major highlight of this resource is that it can be printed off and disseminated with relevant staff to be posted in their office. When delivering TA, we can pre-populate these forms for you. Be sure to reach out to your tribal TA specialist who can provide individual assistance to you upon request. We hope this new resource becomes a staple with a long-lasting positive impact on the lives of our grantees. And remember, you can always request technical assistance through the TCBC, or your regional program specialist by emailing us at tcbc@mn-e.com or by calling the number provided here. We know you may still have lots of questions, so be sure to check out the ARP Act Child Care Stabilization Funds Frequently Asked Questions for some more information. And we will also drop the contact information as well as the ARP Act Frequently Asked Questions link in the chat box today. And now I'm going to pass it off to Shar to facilitate the question portion of our session.
Thank you, Tricia. We're now opening the floor for questions. Please raise your Zoom hand or you can share your questions in the chat box. So as we are waiting, it would be interesting to know if anyone in the room has implemented their ARP stabilization grants, or maybe share the stage that they are in, either exploring, developing, initial implementation. It would be great for other grantees on the line to hear. Tricia, as we monitor the chat, would you like to just go over the resources on the next slide?
I sure will.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a list of resources for you, and a lot of them we have dropped into the chat box today, but one that I do want to point out to you is the first one is our TCVC Art Act landing page. There are a lot of information out there. There's so much information, but if you will take just a few minutes to review this landing page, it has every bit of information that you will need on the ARP Act. It has your frequently asked questions. It has all of the information about stabilization grants. So please check that out if you have a minute. The next resource that we have is the Stabilization Fund Information Memorandum. This is the Office of Child Care policy guidance for the stabilization funds. And it tells you also what there is required, what you need to be sure that you're implementing. And we also have these included on our TCBC ARP Act landing page as well. The next one is the Child Care Stabilization Funding Guidance. These are also full of information based on the ARP Act, on questions and guidance, and any information that you might need to begin implementing your child care stabilization programs. The next one is the overview of the child care stabilization guidance, and it has all of the information about, again, anything that you might need to know or questions that you might have about how do I implement these? How do I get this started? What are the requirements that I need to be sure to know? The next one is navigating the child care relief funding processes. And that is also talks about, that will also inform you on all of the child care relief funding programs, not just the ARP one. So it's a great place for information about all of the different funding sources. The next one is the Strengthening Stabilization Grant with integrity with internal controls. We dropped that one earlier. That's a great one to make sure that you are monitoring and reporting, and you have all of those things in place that you will need to be sure that you have your stabilization controls in place. The next one is the Fiscal on Demand session, and that is helpful for anyone in fiscal or even CCDF administrators that may need to refresh or brush up on those different topics. And then the last one is the American Indian and Alaska Native Child Care and Development Fund Fiscal Guide. And that's another great guide for a fiscal department or even a CCDF administrator on any of the fiscal areas with relation to the CCDF fund. So those are some great resources that, and again, I can't brag on our website enough, Shar, because I really love the way it's set up, and it has little areas for every area of the CCDF plan, as well as the different funding sources for the ARP Act stabilization. So I just really wanted to highlight that one. But it really is true that I really do like that website.
Thanks for sharing all of those resources, Tricia. And I echo that. Check out the website. There's a lot of information on there. And we did have one question into the chat box that they were wondering if the slides would be available to participants. And yes, all of the slides will be available on the ACF Indigenous Programs Conference landing page, and you should be able to download them directly from there. I was also curious if anyone was concerned about the obligation deadline. Or if you have any challenges that you're facing getting this off the ground, maybe if you're willing to share, we would be more than happy to assist you or possibly share some of the innovative practices other grantees use to kind of overcome some of those challenges. And I also wanted to, oh, do you have a fiscal policy that tribes can adopt stating receipts aren't required for this fund? Let's see, it's something we could definitely research. Rachel, did you want to address that, or would you like TCBC to talk more about that?
Great. So this is Rachel McKinnon. I am a child care program specialist in the Office of Child Care. And Lisa, her allergies got the best of her by the end of her section. So I'm still on the line here. We don't have sample policies saying that receipts aren't required. I believe we talk about that a little more in the guidance. So if you're looking for some kind of like authorization that you can provide to your fiscal staff, I think that is addressed in the IM, but I think the TCBC is a great resource in terms of if you need to get like sample language about that. So that would be a great instance in which they could provide some additional TA for you.
Thank you, Rachel. I also think reaching out to your regional program specialist, they could put you in touch with the TCBC team. There might be a grantee that one of our TA specialists have been working with specifically that would have an example of fiscal policies that they adapted and might be willing to share. I know we do have some samples from other tribal lead agencies, some of whom we've spotlighted today, that they're willing to share, for example, their application, the worksheets that the providers use to fill out their expenses, some of the policies and procedures for accepting applications that they develop. So there is a pool of some samples from grantees that are happy to share and assist other tribes. All right. We'll give it another minute or two to see if anyone else has any questions. I know sometimes when you're typing into the chat box, there's a little bit of a lag, but we want to make sure that you do have the information you need in order to move your stabilization grant program forward. Well, we want to thank you for joining us today. I know there was a lot of information shared with you today. You may want to download the slides at a later date and really look through them, and always reach out to your regional office if there is something that you thought you heard and you weren't quite sure to get some clarification. So thank you so much for attending day 2 of the 2022 ACF Indigenous Programs Conference. We hope this was both informative and inspiring. Before we depart today, I wanted to highlight 2 items. Please continue to visit the ACF Indigenous Programs Conference website to explore the virtual exhibitor hall, to view ACF grantee recipient projects throughout the United States and Pacific Islands. You can find this link into the chat box. Also visit the ACF resource page to access more detailed information on the ACF program offices and partners. And we want to thank everyone for joining this session today.
And before we end, also, please make sure you all take the time to provide us some feedback on this section of the survey link I redropped in the chat. And I've also provided the ACF Indigenous Programs Conference website for you so you can attend, and be sure to look up on the next day's session.
And I also see Nadia posted information on tomorrow's events, a link in the chat as well. So make sure you check that out if you have time to attend some sessions tomorrow. I know they'll be very informative. So I'll leave the room open for just a little bit, just to make sure that you've had time to click on the links that you're interested in and meeting. Thanks, everyone.